Well, well, read. Just kidding. Hopefully it's not frozen up. All right, so going to continue with Island of the Blue Dolphins. We're going to read chapter 9 today. So hopefully you have been enjoying the story so far. So here's where we're at in the story. We have Karana lives on the island off the coast of California with her tribe, her community. Unfortunately, some Russian fur traders came in and they got in an argument with the tribe and they all fought and many of her tribe were killed. And so one of the older men and one of the leaders of the tribe decided he was going to take a canoe and sail for the coast of California to get a big ship to come back and take the people to the mainland to hopefully have a better life. It worked. A ship came, the tribe got on the ship, and they're about ready to sail to California when Karana looks up and she sees her brother running along the cliff edge. And so she jumps off the ship into the water, and her brother are now all alone on the island, waiting for the boat to hopefully come back soon. Unfortunately, as we just read, Rama was killed by some wild dogs. And so now Karana is truly all alone. And she swore that she would kill those wild dogs. But right now she's all alone. So let's go ahead and join in chapter 9. I do not remember much of this time, except that many suns rose and set. I thought about what I was going to do now that I was all alone. I did not leave the village. Not until I had eaten all of the abalones did I leave, and then only to gather more. Yet I do remember the day that I decided I would never live in the village again. It was a morning of thick fog and the sound of far-off waves breaking on the shore. I had never noticed before how silent the village was. Fog crept in and out of the empty huts. It made shapes as it drifted, and they reminded me of all the people who were dead and those who were gone. The noise of the surf seemed to be their voices speaking. I sat for a long time, seeing these shapes and hearing the voices, until the sun came out and the fog vanished. Then I made a fire against the wall of the house. When it was burned to the earth, I started a fire in another house. Thus, one by one, I destroyed them all, so that there were only ashes left to mark the village of Galasat. There was nothing to take away with me except a basket of food. I therefore traveled fast, and before night fell, I reached the place where I had decided to live until the ship returned. This place lay on a headland, a half league to the west of Coral Cove. There was a large rock on that headland and 2 stunted trees. Behind the rock was a clear place about 10 steps across, which was sheltered from the wind, from which I could see the harbor and the ocean. A spring of water flowed from a ravine nearby. That night I climbed onto the rock to sleep. It was flat on top and wide enough for me to stretch out. Also, it was so high from the ground that I did not need to fear the wild dogs while I was sleeping. I had not seen them again since the day they had killed Ramo, but I was sure they would soon come to my new camp. The rock was also a safe place to store the food I had brought with me and everything I should gather. Since it was still winter, and any day the ship might return, there was no use to store food I would not need. This gave me time to make weapons to protect myself from the dogs, which I felt would sometime attack me, to kill them all, one by one. I had a club I had found in one of the huts, but I needed a bow and arrows and a large spear. The spear which I had taken from the slain dog was too small. It was good for spearing fish and little else. The laws of Galasat forbade the making of weapons by women of the tribe, so I went out to search for any that might have been left behind. I went first to where the village had been and sifted the ashes for spearheads, and then, finding none, to the place where the canoes were hidden, believing that weapons might have been stored there with food and water. Found nothing in the canoes under the cliff. Then, remembering the chest that Aleuts had brought to shore, I set out for Coral Cove. I had seen that chest on the beach during the battle, but did not remember that the hunters had taken it with them when they fled. The beach was empty except for rows of seaweed washed in by the storm. The tide was out, and I looked in the place where the chest had lain. It was just below the ledge Ulape and I stood on while we watched the battle. The sand was smooth, and I dug many small holes with a stick. I dug in a wide circle, thinking that the storm might have covered it with sand. Near the center of the circle, the stick hit something hard, which I was sure was a rock. But as I dug deeper with my hands, I saw it was the black lid of the chest. All morning I worked, moving the sand away. The chest lay deep from the washing of the waves, and I did not try to dig it out, but only so I could raise the lid. As the sun rose high, the tide came rushing up the beach and filled the hole with sand. Each wave covered the chest deeper until it was completely hidden. I stood on the place, bracing myself against the waves so that I would not have to look for it again. When the tide turned, I began to dig with my feet, working them down, and then with my hands. The chest was filled with beads and bracelets and earrings of many colors. I forgot about the spearheads I had come for. I held each of the trinkets to the sun, turning them so that they caught the light. I put on the longest string of beads, which were blue, and a pair of blue bracelets, which exactly fitted my wrists, and walked down the shore, admiring myself. I walked the whole length of the cove. The beads and the bracelets made tinkling sounds. I felt like the bride of a chief as I walked there by the waves. I came to the foot of the trail where the battle had been fought. Suddenly I remembered those who had died there and the men who had brought the jewels I was wearing. I went back to the chest. For a long time I stood beside it, looking at the bracelets and the beads hanging from my neck, so beautiful and bright in the sun. They do not belong to the Aleuts, I said. They belong to me. But even as I said this, I knew that I could never wear them. One by one, I took them off. I also took the rest of the beads from the chest. Then I walked through the waves and flung them all far away out into the deep water. There were no iron spearheads in the chest. I closed the lid and covered it with sand. I looked along the bottom of the trail, but finding nothing there that I could use, gave up my search. For many days, I did not think of the weapons again, not until the wild dogs came one night and sat under the rock and howled. They were gone at daylight, but not far. During the day, I could see them slinking through the brush, watching me. That night, they came back to the headland. I had buried what was left of my supper, but they dug it up, snarling and fighting among themselves over the scraps. Then they began to pace back and forth at the foot of the rock, sniffing the air, for they could smell my tracks and knew that I was somewhere near. For a long time, I lay on the rock while they trotted around below me. The rock was high, and they could not climb it, but I was still fearful. As I lay there, I wondered what would happen to me if I went against the law of our tribe, which forbade the making of weapons by women. If I did not think of it at all and made those things, which I must have to protect myself, would the four winds blow in from the four directions of the world and smother me as I made the weapons? Or would the earth tremble, as many said, and bury me beneath its falling rocks? Or as others said, would the sea rise over the island in a terrible flood? Would the weapons break in my hands at the moment when my life was in danger, which is what my father had said? I thought about these things for 2 days, and on the third night, when the wild dogs returned to the rock, I made up my mind that no matter what befell me, I would make the weapons. In the morning, I set about it, though I felt very fearful. I wished to use a sea elephant's tusk for the tip of the spear, and because it is hard and of the right shape. There were many of these animals on the shore near my camp, but I lacked a weapon with which to kill one. Our men usually hunted them with a strong net made of bull kelp, which they threw over an animal while it slept. To do this, at least 3 men were needed, and even then the sea elephant often dragged the net into the sea and got away. I used instead the root of a tree, which I shaped into a point and hardened in the fire. This I bound to a long shaft with the green sinews of a seal I killed with a rock. The bow and arrows took more time and caused me great difficulty. I had a bowstring, but wood which would be bent and yet had the proper strength was not easy to find. I searched the ravines for several days before I found it, trees being very scarce on the island of the Blue Dolphins. Wood for the arrows was easier to find, and also the stone for the tips and the feathers for the ends of the shafts. Gathering these things was not the most of the trouble. I had seen weapons made, but I knew little about it. I had seen my father sitting in the hut on winter nights, scraping the wood for scraping the wood for the shafts, chipping the stones for the tips and tying the feathers. Yet I had watched him and really seen nothing. I had watched, but not with the eyes of one who would ever do it. For this reason, I took many days and had many failures before I fashioned a bow and arrows that could be used. Wherever I went now, whether to the shore, when I gathered shellfish, or to the ravine for water, I carried this weapon in a sling on my back. I practiced with it and also with the spear. The dogs did not come to the camp during this time I was making the weapons, though every night I could hear them howling. Once, after the weapons were made, I saw the leader of the pack, the one with the gray hair and the yellow eyes, watching me from the brush. I had gone to the ravine for water, and he stood on the hill above the spring, looking down at me. He stood very quiet, with only his head showing over the top of a cholla bush. He was too far away for me to reach him with an arrow. Whenever I went during the day, I felt secure with my new weapons, and I waited patiently for the time when I could use them against the wild dogs that had killed Ramo. I did not go to the cave where they had their lair, since I was sure that they would soon come to the camp. Yet every night I climbed on the rock to sleep. After the first night I spent there, which was uncomfortable because of the uneven places in the rock, I carried dry seaweed up from the beach and made a bed for myself. It was a pleasant place to stay there on the headland. The stars were bright overhead, and I lay and counted the ones that I knew and gave names to many that I did not know. In the morning, the gulls flew out from their nests in the crevices of the cliff. They circled down to the tide pools, where they stood first on one leg, then on the other, splashing water over themselves and combing their feathers with curved beaks. Then they flew off down the shore to look for food. Beyond the kelp beds, pelicans were already hunting, soaring high over the clear water, diving straight down if they sighted a fish to strike the sea with great splash that I could hear. I also watched the otter hunting in the kelp. These shy little animals had come back soon after the Aleuts had left, and now there seemed to be as many of them as before. The early morning sun shone like gold on their glossy pelts. Yet, as I lay there on the high rock looking at the stars, I thought about the ship which belonged to the white men. And at dawn, as light spread across the sea, my first glance was towards the little harbor of Coral Cove. Every morning I would look for the ship there, thinking that it might have come in the night. And each morning I could see nothing except the birds flying over the sea. When there were people at Galasat, I was always up before the sun and busy with many things. But now that there was little to do, I did not leave the rock until the sun was high. I would eat and then go to the spring and take a bath in the warm water. Afterwards, I went down to the shore where I could gather a few abalones and sometimes spear a fish for my supper. Before darkness fell, I climbed onto the rock and watched the sea until slowly it disappeared in the night. The ship did not come, and thus winter passed and the spring. All right, it's the end of chapter 9. Thanks for bearing with me. Let's hope that this continues to work. So, Already talked a little bit about how the chapter started, what's happened so far. Karana jumped off the ship to get with her brother, and then unfortunately Rama was killed by the wild dogs, and now Karana is all alone, and she's going to kill these dogs. The problem is that in her culture, women can't make weapons. And so she has to decide if she's going to break her cultural rules, even though no one is there. All right, so a couple of things. Many suns rose and set. So it's this idea of many days passing. She destroyed her village. She burned down all the houses, probably because it was a sad memory for her. So she destroyed all that. All right, we've talked about headland before, so just as a memory here, headlands, she's up at the top, the edge. All right, a spring of water, water coming up from the ground. This would be fresh water, so she could drink it, not salt water from the ocean. A ravine is kind of like a tiny canyon, and so that's where she sees the dog. She decides she will break her culture and make for herself a bow and arrow and a spear. You can imagine how difficult that would be.
Yeah.
She goes down and digs up the chest, and she finds these trinkets, the beads, the bracelets, and earrings. And I imagine they were probably similar in color because that's kind of how they're described. But trinkets is this word that just kind of describes, just tiny little things. And in this context, it's the jewelry. All right, flung is to throw. So she finds all of these beads and necklaces, and rather than keeping them, and she thought, look how pretty I am, she takes them off and she starts throwing them out into the ocean. Probably because they're a reminder of the battle, and they're a reminder of all the people who were killed. So she just throws them into the ocean and forgets about them. All right, again, we have this word slinking. That's back away slowly. We saw it earlier where the dogs slunk, past tense. So slinking again. All right, forbade is to say no. So her culture forbids her from making weapons because they believed women could not make weapons. All right, and then of course we got the leader of the pack, the main dog, which she sees and which of course she hates because of its killing of Rama. And then it ends very sadly with this sentence. It says, and thus winter passes and the spring, which tells us that the boat didn't come back in a few weeks and the boat did not come back in a few months. The entire season has passed, months and months and months now. So we're only getting tiny glimpses of what she does, but the truth is she has been alone now for months and months. And that's kind of sad. So, all right, it looks like the technology worked. Yay! All right, so thank you for listening and participating. And so we'll see you again when we do chapter 10. All right, until then, take care. Bye.